Hello BookTube! It has been way too long since I've recorded a video, so I decided to do a combination April and May wrap up since I only read one book in May and 5 in April. So let's get started! So the first book that I finished in April was The Work by Wes Moore. This is a nonfiction book that is kind of about the work that we do and how people find work that is meaningful to them. I first heard about this book when the author Wes Moore was on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and I just really liked what he had to say, so I decided to check out his book. So this book basically goes through Wes Moore's life since high school so far, where he went to college, where all he's worked, how he got to where he is today, his time in the military. But he also includes stories of different people who have found work that is important and meaningful to them, and how they ended up in that work, and what their work is like. This was a particularly interesting book for me because I finished grad school a year ago and still don't have a job in my field. I have a great job that I'm very lucky to have, but it doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with Spanish. So I thought this was a really interesting book about how people end up in the jobs that they end up in and take different paths to their work. To be honest, at this point, I read this one about 2 months ago, and so I don't really remember all of the details, but I remember that it seemed like there was a lot of good advice in it, or just quotes that really made me stop and think. So I would definitely recommend this one. I'm actually thinking of rereading it myself, and I believe I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. The next book I read was I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai. This is an autobiography by Malala Yousafzai, and I thought this was a fantastic book. So in case you're unfamiliar with her story, Malala Yousafzai is a teenager from Pakistan who is the youngest ever recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. I think she's 17 now, and she received that for her work in helping girls all over the world have access to education. Her father was a teacher and principal for most of her life, and so he very much inspired a love of learning in her and just an appreciation for the opportunities that education would afford her. In a place where girls were at times directly banned from going to school past a certain age, Malala and her father fought against that. They told their story in newspapers, continued to operate their school, and then the unthinkable happened. One day when Malala was 15, she was on her way home from school, and the Taliban stopped the bus that she was on and shot her in the face. So miraculously, she survived with the help of a team of doctors from England, and she now lives in Birmingham, England. She and her father now have a nonprofit organization dedicated to making sure that girls all over the world have the opportunity for an education. Overall, I thought this book was fantastic. Sometimes it was a bit difficult to keep up with because a lot of the book is about the history of Pakistan, particularly in the end of the 20th century and beginning of this century, and unfortunately 90% of the names and events that were mentioned were completely unfamiliar to me. But that's something that I've been wanting to learn more about anyway. History classes in the US, especially like in high school, are so focused on the US and Europe, and so I've been wanting to learn more about other regions and countries like Pakistan that aren't covered so much in schooling. Malala talks about how the arrival of the Taliban in her community changed their everyday lives and made them fear for their lives at times, with good reason as it turned out. But I love Malala's courage in the face of that danger and her determination to not let the Taliban win and continue fighting to make sure that all girls have the same opportunities that she has had. So overall, I highly, highly recommend this book. The next book I read was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. I have been wanting to read this book for a while because I'd seen it on several BookTube videos and thought it looked right up my alley. I finally broke down and bought the ebook in April because the waiting list at my library for the book was just ridiculous. So I got the ebook and I loved this book. Basically, at the beginning of this book, a pandemic breaks out and it kind of shows what life was like for a few of the characters before the pandemic, and then it fast forwards to quite a few years later to show what life is like for those who have survived the pandemic, and it's definitely a stark contrast. I don't know why, but I love books like this that focus on sociology and survival and civilization and just what people do to try and work together and survive in circumstances where everything about life as they know it has changed. This is one of those books where the characters' lives all kind of intersect and intertwine, and I really like when that happens. And I won't spoil it, and I don't want to say too much more about the book for fear of spoiling it, but I did also really enjoy the ending. I've read a few books lately where I liked the rest of the book and then the end was kind of meh, but I really liked the ending of this book. So if you like books like that kind of talk about humanity and humanity's desire for survival and post-apocalyptic books, then I would definitely recommend this book. The next book I read, I actually own, one of the few that I'm talking about today that I have. This is Lost in a Good Book by Jasper Fforde, and Jasper Fforde is one of my new favorite authors. I read the first book in this series, The Air Affair, last year, and I read the first book in his other series, The Big Over Easy, last year. This is the second book in the Thursday Next series, which focuses on a literary detective named Thursday Next, who lives in an alternate universe Britain in the 1980s. So in this alternate universe Britain, Shakespeare and classic literature is wildly popular, like Harry Potter levels of hype here. Dodos have been genetically engineered and brought back to life, so Thursday has a pet dodo. And then there's some things that, although not exactly true to our world, aren't really far from the reality of it, like the fact that in Thursday's world there is a giant corporation that controls pretty much everything about life in Britain, like the TV shows that are on and what's said on those TV shows, what wars Britain's fighting, what products are sold, usually by the giant corporation. So, it's not terribly far from reality, which is kind of sad. So I don't want to give away too much about this book in particular if you haven't read the first in the series yet, but this book, like all of Jasper Fforde's books, is a ton of fun. His style is completely wacky, like think Douglas Adams or Terry Pratchett. He just jam-packs his books with all of these subplots and strange characters and puns, and it still somehow manages to work. This book has time travel, literary puns galore, mammoth migrations, caveman rights, and just, I lost track of the number of times that I laughed out loud. So if you're looking for something fun, I would definitely go pick up The Air Affair and read it first, and then pick this one up. It's hilarious, but it also has a lot of layers to it, so I highly recommend it. And the last book that I read in April, which I actually read this book during the Dewey's 24-hour readathon, was The Last Policeman by Ben H. Winters. Funnily, I won this book during last year's Dewey's 24-hour readathon, and I thought it was appropriate to read it during this year's. So I really enjoyed this book. Between this and Lost in a Good Book, these might have been my two favorites that I've read recently. Although I've read a lot of good books lately. I loved Station 11 too, so, but this one was really good. The Last Policeman is about a police officer named Hank Palace living in New Hampshire, and in the world of this book, scientists have determined that a huge asteroid is going to hit the Earth in a matter of months, basically destroying all life as we know it. And as you can imagine, society has started to crumble considering this news. People are leaving their jobs, some people are falling into depression, gasoline is becoming hard to come by, and then there's Hank Palace, and he has dreamed all his young life of becoming a police detective, and now he has accomplished that dream, and he's assigned a case of a man found at a McDonald's bathroom in an apparent suicide, which, you know, considering the circumstances, this is not their first suicide in recent weeks. And Hank decides that it doesn't look right, that he doesn't think it's a suicide, the little clues don't add up, and so he makes it his personal mission to solve this man's murder, as he believes, and bring this man's killer to justice, despite the fact that most of the rest of the police force and the rest of the world pretty much has completely given up. I just loved this book so much, and I loved the exploration of what different people would do if they knew for a fact that the world was going to end in 6 months. I liked Hank's determination to solve this man's murder, and not allow himself to become apathetic to this man's life and death. I mean, even though the rest of the world is going to die in 6 months, he doesn't let that affect the value of this man's life. And I kind of think maybe Hank was trying to prove to himself that his own life mattered, that he could do something important with the little time that he has left. And so I really liked this book. It's actually the first in a trilogy, and I can't wait to get the other two in the series because since it's a trilogy, I can go ahead and tell you that the asteroid has not struck by the end of this book. And I'm really curious to see if the author's going to go through with it and if the third book is just going to be fade to black, everyone's dead. Like, how are you going to end a book like that? So I'm really looking forward to picking up the next one in this series, and I highly recommend it. And the last book that I read recently, this was the only book that I read in May. I read Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, and I know I'm way behind the bandwagon on this one, but I had been spoiled a little bit for it, but it didn't take too much out of the enjoyment of the book, and I have to say, it was really good. It might be one of the most messed up books I've ever read in my life, but it was really good. So, this is a book about a married couple in their 30s, Nick and Amy, and they have recently moved from New York to Nick's small hometown in Missouri. And then one day, Amy disappears. And of course, because he's the husband, the police automatically assume that Nick had something to do with Amy's disappearance, even though he's insisting that he had nothing to do with it. He has no idea where she is. And the beginning of the book is divided up between Nick's point of view after her disappearance, talking to the police and everything, and then Amy's diary from before her disappearance. And the two different perspectives paint a very different picture of what's happening. And you start to question what's really going on here? Who's telling the truth? Where is Amy? And then about halfway through the book, everything changes and it's a mess. And I was a little prepared for it, but not prepared enough for how messed up this book is. It was so absorbing. I hardly ever read books in a single day. I did for The Last Policeman because it was the day of the readathon, but I read this book in a single sitting too. I could not put it down. This book is just so horrifying and dark and shows just this, I don't even know, this awful, darker side of marriage, or what marriage could be or can be if people allow it to. And I was kind of worried that this wouldn't live up to the hype because it had so much hype, but I have to say it kind of did. It was really good. So if by some miracle you haven't read this book yet, then I would definitely recommend you pick it up. It, like I said, it is very dark, so be prepared for that, but it's a very good book. So those are the books that I read in April and May, and like I said, Gone Girl was the only book that I read in May, and I read it near the beginning of May. So I think it kind of broke me for reading for a while because I picked up another couple books after that one, and they just didn't draw me in like Gone Girl did, and so I just kind of stopped reading for a while, but I'm really excited to get back into it. I bought a few new books, so look forward to a book haul video soon,